While the Austrian Grand Prix was full of excitement and saw Charles Leclerc secure a surprise win to close the gap at the top of the standings, it was the FIA that again took the headlines with some surprising decisions and incredibly strict penalties. Some were fair, some were questionable, and some were just completely wrong. The FIA are under a lot of scrutiny at the moment, and this weekend has only made things worse. Will Formula 1 look to force a break from the FIA soon, or can the governing body sort itself out before it's too late? We're going to look at the huge inconsistencies over the weekend and how the F1 teams have responded. Let's get started. The list of drivers that weren't penalised over the weekend of the Austrian Grand Prix is shorter than the list of those that were penalised. Some were completely fair, such as Valtteri Bottas's grid penalty for using too many engine parts. You can't really have any complaints about that one. Some, though, were far more questionable, like Sebastian Vettel's track limit penalty and George Russell being investigated for entering the track illegally while the race was red flagged. And one was just straight up wrong. The FIA revoked Zhou Guan Yu's time penalty for track limits after the race, when they realised he hadn't actually exceeded the limit that required 5 times to be penalised. It was all a bit of a mess, to be honest. The FIA has come under fire at almost every race weekend this season, but Austria was the worst of the lot. They promised an in-depth review and change of procedure after mistakes made by Michael Masi at the 2021 season finale in Abu Dhabi. The result was a change in race director. Michael Masi was moved to a different role, and Eduardo Freitas and Niels Wittich stepped in to replace him on a rotating basis. By all evidence, this has not solved the problems. Rumblings of a Formula 1 plan to split from the FIA have been growing louder and louder throughout the season, and like trees in front of an avalanche, the FIA seems helpless to stop it. The mistakes are numerous, their responses are meaningless, and the teams are demanding change. Even things as innocuous as FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem tweeting about the great levels of team spirit in F1 have been met with ridicule. After qualifying on Friday, in midst of some already questionable decisions about his race directors and reports of fan abuse, both sexist and racist, the president decided to try and draw attention away from the problems. He highlighted the great team spirit at Mercedes, following George Russell and Lewis Hamilton's apologies to their mechanics after wrecking their cars. The president can't seem to get anything right at the moment and was mocked for highlighting this instead of addressing the reports of harassment. That wasn't the only FIA-related problem on Friday, though. That's right, we hadn't even seen cars racing before there were multiple complaints. Sebastian Vettel was hit with a suspended fine of €25,000 after an off-track incident. The Aston Martin driver was called up to the stewards for his behaviour in Friday evening's driver briefing, with no specific details initially released at the time. However, the stewards later explained what occurred in the Red Bull Ring paddock. The driver, Sebastian Vettel, left the drivers' meeting that was held at 7:30 on Friday the 8th of July without permission, and expressing frustration at the meeting, read the steward's decision document. He later apologised and apparently had a very productive conversation where he was able to air his grievances with the FIA over how they were policing races. Him and Fernando Alonso were furious with the inconsistency the FIA had been showing and felt that in their very long careers, the FIA had learnt nothing and was in a worse state now than it had ever been. Not a great look when one of your most senior drivers is calling you out like that. Mick Schumacher was another to call them out over the weekend, though his qualms over inconsistencies was related to his battle with Max Verstappen at the Silverstone Grand Prix. Mick was battling Verstappen late in the race for 7th position, and though it was a hard fight, it just about stayed clean. In Mick's opinion, though, that is only because of him, and Verstappen should have been penalised for how he was driving. FIA's racing rules had been clarified before the season in an attempt to avoid the types of mood made by Verstappen last season, where he would run his car as close as possible to the white track boundary line, leaving his rival no room to race. After not being penalised for his actions at Silverstone, Schumacher has suggested the rules have changed again. From my understanding, the rules changed at the beginning of this year, so once cars were next to each other, you had to leave the space, said Schumacher. This was not the case at Silverstone. I knew he wasn't going to leave the space, but I was clear on the rule changes at the beginning of the year and the consequences of it. The fact there were no consequences for it means the rules have changed again. We checked, and from what Mick says and looking at the footage, some of Verstappen's moves definitely looked like they were on the limit. Mick went on to call for clarity over the moves and seemed very frustrated at the inconsistency with which rules were applied. We aren't done with the Friday complaints though. Don't worry, there was loads that went wrong in the race as well, but we think the most ridiculous one was on the Friday in qualifying. Multiple drivers in Formula 1, 2, and 3 had been given penalties on Friday for exceeding track limits, and there had been a lot of deleted laps in qualifying for the sprint race in the Premier class. One of those was Sergio Perez, who had gone off the circuit on more than one occasion in Q2, setting a valid lap time that was good enough for P13. The Mexican made it into the top 10 with a late effort, but it transpired that he had also left the racetrack on that one too. However, the stewards were busy looking at other track limits violations, so they did not initially notice Perez's transgression. This meant that Pierre Gasly was eliminated in 11th place, with Perez under investigation as he prepared to start Q3. Gasly was rightly furious that he missed out the chance to fight for position in Q3 due to the directors missing out on Perez's infringement. He did eventually start P10 and Perez was demoted to P13, but Gasly would definitely have been in with a chance to better that as Hamilton crashed early and was 7 seconds slower than 8th place Alonso. What the stewards did manage to catch though was George Russell entering the track without permission after his crash in Q3, when there were no cars left on the track. Will Buxton was quick to ridicule them after they had missed Perez. George crossing the track under a red flag has been noted by the stewards. Good to see they've got their focus on all the important things today, said Buxton. When it got to Sunday, the complaints about track limit penalties did not stop. Multiple drivers were penalised, and in a couple of cases, those penalties were handled very poorly. Sebastian Vettel spoke up after the race because he received his 5-second penalty with no warning, thinking he was still on 3 strikes, too short of the required 5 to get a penalty. "I had 3 strikes and I didn't get a warning," the 4-time world champion said after being informed of his punishment following Sunday's race. "So I don't know how I can get told a penalty if I don't get a warning, because I had 3 strikes. That was what I was told until the last lap, and then it goes to 5. It's a bit strange." Zhou Guanyu's penalty was the worst of the mistakes though, with the driver having his penalty rescinded after the race when the race directors realised they'd made a mistake and he hadn't exceeded track limits more than 4 times. It was a terrible look for the race directors after Perez's penalty. 2 huge mistakes in the same weekend did not go down well with the drivers, as Max Verstappen said after the race. He said the onslaught of track limits, warnings and penalties during the Austrian Grand Prix just didn't look good for the sport. "We've had a conversation between drivers and at the end of the day, I think more or less on most things we agree. Of course, everyone has their own opinion about certain things. But like track limits, I think track limits debate this weekend has been a bit of a joke. Not only in F1, but in F2 and F3. It's easy to say from the outside, yeah, you just have to stay within the white lines. Yeah, I mean, it sounds very easy, but it's not," Verstappen said. Russell went one step further when he added his voice to the argument and called for a change of race director. "I agree we need to stick to one race director," said the Brit. "We need to have a bit more consistency with the stewarding. We come to the following event and often the steward at the previous event isn't there, so there's no accountability, no explanations of decisions. We ask questions and it's difficult to get a straightforward answer because almost a bit blame is being put onto someone else who isn't there. So it's tricky. Everyone has their own interpretations. I think when you have one race director, things can generally be more consistent. At this point, it's hard to see how the FIA are going to come back. Every weekend, they make more mistakes and never seem to learn. If you look on our channel, you'll see that almost every race weekend, there's something they do that really pisses off the teams and drivers. The only question remaining now is what will be the straw that breaks the camel's back and sees F1 split from the FIA. What do you think the FIA should do to address all of this? Let us know what you think in the comment section down below, and until next time, drive safe and bye bye.